Garrett Hayes crouched beside the failing campfire, feeding it another piece of fuel wood from his dwindling supply while scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of light. The forest around them was silent in the wrong way, not the peaceful quiet of empty wilderness, but the tense stillness that came when predators were watching and waiting for the right moment to strike. Beside him, wrapped in the emergency thermal blanket from his survival kit, the Keshari girl slept fitfully. Her small form trembled occasionally despite the blanket's insulation, her sleep troubled by dreams he could only imagine given what she'd been through. Her name was Sylara. He'd learned that after hours of careful communication using gestures, drawings scratched in the dirt, and the handful of Keshari words he'd managed to pick up during his 3 months working in the border territories between human settlements and Keshari tribal lands. He'd found her 2 days ago, separated from her people during what looked like a coordinated raid or attack. The signs had been clear even if the specific details weren't. Burned structures still smoldering, scattered belongings abandoned in flight, tracks indicating multiple groups fleeing in different directions. Sylara had been hiding in a collapsed storage building, injured and terrified, when his patrol had passed through the ruins. The Keshari were a slight species, built for speed and agility rather than strength or endurance. Adults averaged about 1.5 meters tall, with delicate features and large eyes adapted for excellent night vision. Their skin displayed subtle patterns that shifted with emotional state, evolutionary remnants of sophisticated camouflage capabilities that their ancestors had used for survival. Sylara was young, perhaps equivalent to human 12 or 13 years old, though Keshari development didn't map precisely to human ages. She was small even for her species, which made her seem even more vulnerable. Getting her to trust him enough to leave her hiding place had taken hours of patient coaxing. The Keshari had good reasons to be wary of humans. The border territories were contested ground where both species' expansion interests collided, creating tensions that sometimes exploded into violence. Some human factions viewed the Keshari as obstacles to be removed or relocated. Some Keshari groups saw humans as invaders to be driven back by any means necessary. The moderate voices on both sides were often drowned out by extremists who saw cooperation as betrayal. Garrett worked for a neutral monitoring organization, trying to prevent conflicts and protect civilians caught between the larger political forces. It was frustrating work that often felt futile, but he'd chosen it deliberately after leaving military service, because he was tired of being part of the problem rather than part of solutions. When he'd finally coaxed Sylara out of her hiding place, he'd found she had a badly sprained ankle, multiple cuts and bruises, and was dehydrated and malnourished. He'd treated what he could with his medical kit, given her water and concentrated food rations, and tried to figure out how to reunite her with her people. But the forest had grown increasingly dangerous. The same raiders who'd attacked her settlement were apparently still in the area. Garrett had spotted signs of their continued movement, heard distant sounds that suggested they were conducting sweeps through the territory looking for survivors or valuables left behind. Heading back to the nearest human settlement would take 3 days on foot, and Garrett couldn't move quickly while helping an injured child. But staying in the open meant being vulnerable to whoever was hunting through these territories. So he'd found this position, a small clearing with decent sightlines in most directions, defensible if it came to combat, with a rock outcropping at their backs that protected one approach and provided some shelter from wind. He'd built a small fire for warmth and to keep away the local wildlife, though he knew it also advertised their position to anyone looking for them. Now it was the second night since finding Sylara. She'd walked as far as she could manage today despite her injured ankle, showing a toughness and determination that had impressed Garrett. But she was exhausted now, barely able to keep her eyes open despite her obvious fear of the darkness and whatever might be lurking in it. Garrett adjusted his position slightly, working out a cramp in his leg while keeping his rifle within easy reach. The weapon was loaded with non-lethal rounds, his organization's policy for border patrol work. But he also carried lethal ammunition in a separate magazine if the situation deteriorated to the point where lives were immediately threatened. He hoped it wouldn't come to that. He'd seen enough violence during his military service. These days he preferred solutions that didn't involve anyone dying. The fire popped softly, sending up a small shower of sparks. Garrett added another small piece of wood, just enough to keep the flames alive without making the fire large enough to be visible from a distance. He needed to conserve his fuel supply. Dawn was still at least 6 hours away. Sylara made a small sound in her sleep, a whimper that suggested nightmares. Garrett glanced at her, seeing her skin patterns flickering rapidly even in sleep. The colors shifting through what he'd learned were distress indicators. She was dreaming about the attack, probably. About whatever she'd witnessed before managing to hide. About losing her family and her home. Garrett carefully reached out and placed his hand gently on her shoulder, a light presence meant to reassure without fully waking her. "You're safe," he murmured quietly in Keshari, using one of the phrases he'd learned. "I'm here. Nothing will hurt you while I watch." Sylara's rapid pattern shift slowed slightly. She didn't wake, but some part of her sleeping mind apparently registered his presence and found it comforting rather than threatening. Garrett returned his attention to the perimeter, systematically scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. His night vision wasn't as good as Keshari capabilities, but his military training had taught him how to watch for movement and listen for sounds that didn't belong in natural forest environments. The hours passed slowly. Garrett shifted position periodically to keep his muscles from stiffening. He fed the fire small amounts of fuel at regular intervals. He monitored Sylara's breathing and the small sounds she made in sleep, making sure she wasn't developing a fever or showing signs of her injuries worsening. Around what his chronometer indicated was 300 hours, he heard something that made every muscle in his body tense. Voices in the distance, speaking a language he didn't recognize but in tones and cadences that suggested coordination and purpose. The raiders were still searching the area, and they were getting closer to his position. Garrett moved with careful precision, adding dirt to the fire to damp it down and reduce its light signature. The flames died to barely glowing embers, plunging their position into near darkness that his human eyes struggled to adapt to quickly. He reached out and gently shook Sylara's shoulder, waking her as quietly as possible. She came awake with a sharp intake of breath, her large eyes going wide with alarm, her skin patterns flashing through rapid color changes that indicated sudden fear. Garrett placed his finger over his lips in what he hoped was a universal gesture for silence. Sylara understood immediately, going very still and quiet despite her obvious terror. He pointed toward the direction of the voices, then made a staying down gesture with his hand flat and palm toward the ground. She nodded understanding, her skin patterns shifting to darker colors that probably served as instinctive camouflage response. They waited in the darkness, the fire reduced to barely visible coals. The voices grew gradually louder, still distant but definitely approaching their area of the forest. Garrett's military training took over, his mind automatically assessing tactical situation and options. He counted at least 3 distinct voices, possibly more. They were spreading out in a search pattern, coordinating with each other to cover ground systematically. They were looking for something, or someone. Sylara trembled beside him, but she made no sound. Garrett kept his rifle ready, positioned so he could bring it to bear quickly if the searchers found their position. But he desperately hoped they would pass by without noticing the damped fire or other signs of recent presence. The voices continued their methodical approach. Garrett could make out individual words now, though he didn't understand the language. The tone suggested they were being thorough, checking likely hiding spots, calling to each other to maintain formation and coverage. Sylara's night vision was significantly better than his. She could probably see the searchers moving through the darkness beyond where Garrett could distinguish more than vague shapes. He felt her tension increase as they drew closer, felt her breathing become shallow and rapid. Garrett carefully put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her slightly closer in a protective gesture. She pressed against his side, small and vulnerable, trusting him to know what to do in this dangerous situation. The searchers came close, terrifyingly close. Garrett could hear individual footsteps now, could make out the distinctive metallic sounds of weapons being handled by people alert and ready to use them. They were armed and prepared to respond with force to whatever they might find. He ran tactical calculations in his mind. His position was defensible but not ideal. The rock outcropping protected their backs but also limited escape routes. He could probably take down 2 or 3 of the searchers before they could return effective fire. But if there were more than that in the group, his chances of protecting both himself and Sylara decreased significantly. And he would need to protect Sylara while engaging, which would limit his tactical options and flexibility. But mostly he hoped, prayed, though he wasn't particularly religious, that they simply wouldn't be discovered at all. Sylara's better night vision allowed her to track the searchers' movements more clearly than Garrett could. He felt her entire body tense as they approached their position, felt her breathing become even more shallow and controlled, as if she was trying to make herself as silent and invisible as possible. The searchers passed within perhaps 15 or 20 meters of where they crouched in the darkness. Garrett could see vague shapes moving through the trees now, could hear them speaking to each other in that unfamiliar language, coordinating their sweep. They paused. For a terrible moment, Garrett thought they'd spotted some sign of presence. The remains of the fire disturbed ground, something that had caught their attention and made them suspicious. His finger moved to his rifle's trigger, preparing for the possibility that he'd need to engage immediately to protect Sylara. But then the searchers moved on, continuing their sweep pattern in a direction that took them away from Garrett and Sylara's position. The voices gradually faded as they moved deeper into the forest, searching other areas. Garrett maintained absolute stillness for another full hour after the last sounds of the searchers had faded into silence. He couldn't risk assuming they'd truly moved on. They might circle back, might have left someone watching while the others continued the sweep. Only when he was as confident as he could be that they'd genuinely moved well beyond the area did he allow himself to relax slightly. Sylara was still pressed against his side, trembling now not just with fear but with cold. The fire had gone completely out during their silent wait, and the night air was chilly enough that he could see his breath when he exhaled. Garrett carefully rebuilt the fire, keeping it very small but enough to provide some warmth. He used dry wood that would produce minimal smoke and positioned himself to block the light from the direction the searchers had gone. Once the fire was burning steadily again, he turned his attention to Sylara. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully interpret, her large eyes reflecting the firelight, her skin patterns showing configurations that seemed different from her earlier fear responses. "They're gone," he said quietly in his limited Keshari vocabulary. "You're safe now. They won't find us." She responded in her own language, speaking too quickly for his basic understanding to follow. But her tone suggested something that might have been gratitude or acknowledgement, or perhaps something more complex, that he didn't have the cultural knowledge to recognize. She remained close to him, even now that the immediate danger had passed. Not pressed against his side anymore, but sitting near enough that their shoulders almost touched, close enough that he could feel the slight warmth radiating from her small body. Garrett realized with sudden clarity what she was doing. She was choosing to stay within his protection, to trust him completely with her safety and her life. She could have panicked during the searchers' approach, could have made noise intentionally or accidentally that would have revealed their position, could have decided that she'd be safer trying to hide separately rather than staying with a human she barely knew. But she'd stayed absolutely silent and still, trusting that Garrett knew what to do and would protect her. That trust felt heavy and precious, a responsibility he hadn't asked for but found himself committed to honoring. The rest of the night passed more quietly. The searchers didn't return. The forest gradually settled into more natural nocturnal sounds, small animals moving through undergrowth, night birds calling, the normal symphony of wilderness rather than the tense silence that indicated predators waiting. Sylara eventually allowed herself to sleep again, this time more peacefully than before. She curled up against the rock outcropping with the thermal blanket wrapped around her, but she'd positioned herself close enough to Garrett that he could reach her easily, close enough that his presence was a tangible reassurance. Garrett maintained his watch, scanning the darkness, feeding the small fire occasionally, keeping guard over the vulnerable life that had been placed in his care. Dawn began to lighten the eastern sky around 5:30 hours. Garrett watched the darkness gradually recede, revealing the forest in shades of gray that slowly gained color as the sun rose above the horizon. Sylara woke as the light increased. She sat up slowly, blinking in the growing illumination, her skin patterns shifting to colors that might have indicated relief or hope, or simply the neutral state that came with feeling safe enough to not need camouflage. "Morning," Garrett said, offering her water from his canteen and some concentrated ration bars for breakfast. She accepted both, eating slowly while watching him with those large, thoughtful eyes that seemed to be constantly assessing and evaluating. After they'd eaten and Garrett had checked her ankle injury, still swollen and painful, but no worse than yesterday. He used gestures and his limited Keshari vocabulary to explain that they needed to keep moving, to get to safety before another night fell. She nodded understanding, her skin patterns showing what might have been determination mixed with residual fear. She stood with difficulty, wincing as her injured ankle took weight. Garrett offered his arm for support, and she accepted it without hesitation, another small gesture of trust that felt significant even if he couldn't articulate exactly why. They began walking, moving slowly through the forest toward where Garrett hoped they'd find either a Keshari settlement that had taken in refugees or a human outpost where he could arrange safe transport for her. The journey would take time, but Garrett had made a commitment during the night, watching over Sylara while she slept beside his fire. He would see her safely to her people, would protect her from whatever dangers they encountered, would honor the trust she'd placed in him. It was the right thing to do, and sometimes, Garrett had learned, doing the right thing. They made slow progress through the forest. Sylara's injured ankle prevented anything approaching normal walking speed, and Garrett had to support much of her weight as they navigated rough terrain, fallen logs, and dense undergrowth. But she didn't complain. Despite obvious pain with every step, despite exhaustion and fear, she tried her best to keep pace and minimize the burden she placed on her protector. Garrett found himself impressed by her resilience. She was just a child, had survived trauma and violence, was injured and separated from everything familiar, dependent on a stranger from a species she had reason to fear. Yet she pushed forward with a determination that spoke to strength of character beyond her years. They took frequent breaks, partly because Sylara needed rest, partly because Garrett wanted to listen and watch for any signs of the raiders or other threats. During these breaks, they'd share water and small amounts of food, and Garrett would check Sylara's injuries and make sure she wasn't developing complications. Communication remained challenging. Garrett's Keshari vocabulary was basic at best, and Sylara appeared to know no standard at all. But they were developing a system of gestures and simple words that allowed basic information exchange. During one midday break, Sylara spoke at length in her own language, her tone suggesting she was trying to tell him something important. Garrett couldn't follow most of it, but he caught what might have been words for family, gone, and thank you. He responded in his limited Keshari, "You are safe now. I will help you find your people." Her skin patterns shifted through configurations. He was learning to associate with complex emotions he didn't fully understand. But she nodded and seemed somewhat comforted. They continued walking. The forest around them showed occasional signs of the conflict that had driven Sylara from her home: burned areas, abandoned equipment, disturbed ground where vehicles had passed. The border territories were becoming increasingly unstable, and Garrett worried about what that meant for both human and Keshari civilians caught in the middle. Around 1400 hours, Garrett heard something that made him signal Sylara to stop and be quiet. Voices ahead speaking in Keshari. Sylara heard them too. Her skin patterns flashed through rapid changes, hope mixed with fear, recognition mixed with uncertainty. Garrett moved forward cautiously, keeping Sylara behind him, approaching the source of the voices carefully to assess whether they represented safety or new danger. They emerged at the edge of a clearing to find a Keshari patrol, 6 individuals in what looked like militia gear, armed and alert, moving through the area in a search pattern. The moment the patrol spotted Garrett, weapons came up, trained on him with the kind of precision that suggested they were prepared to fire if he made any threatening moves. Garrett immediately raised his hands, his rifle slung across his back rather than in a ready position. "I'm not a threat," he called out in Keshari. "I have a child with me, Sylara from the attacked settlement." Sylara stepped out from behind him, speaking rapidly in her own language, her skin patterns shifting through what looked like urgent communication. The patrol leader, an older Keshari whose skin patterns showed the more complex configurations that apparently indicated age and status, lowered their weapon slightly and responded to Sylara. They had a brief, intense conversation that Garrett couldn't follow. Then the leader turned attention to Garrett, studying him with an expression that was difficult to interpret. When they spoke, it was in heavily accented but comprehensible standard. "The child says you found her in the ruins of her village, says you protected her for 2 nights, says she slept beside your watch fire while you kept guard over her." "Yes," Garrett confirmed simply. "She was injured and alone. I've been trying to get her to safety, to find her people." The leader's skin patterns shifted through complex configurations that Garrett was beginning to recognize indicated serious thought or evaluation. "Among my people," the leader said carefully, "choosing to sleep beside someone's watch fire is significant. It means absolute trust, trust that the watcher will protect the sleeper from all harm, even at cost of their own life. For a child to sleep beside a stranger's watch fire, especially a stranger from a different species." The leader paused. "This indicates she believes you would die protecting her before allowing harm to reach her sleeping form." Garrett hadn't known the cultural weight of what Sylara had done when she'd positioned herself beside his fire those 2 nights. He'd simply tried to keep her safe because it was the right thing to do, because she was a child in danger, and he had the skills and resources to help. "I didn't know the significance," he admitted. "I just wanted her to feel safe enough to rest. She needed sleep." "You could have left her," the leader observed. "Many would have. Many of your kind have done far worse to Keshari children, found alone in these territories." The leader's skin patterns shifted to colors that might have indicated reassessment or reconsideration. "Sylara's immediate family was killed in the raid. She has no bloodkin surviving that we know of. Under our customs, the one who protects during the Dark Watch becomes responsible, becomes guardian if they accept the bond that the protected one offers through the trust of sleep." The leader gestured toward Sylara, who was watching this conversation with intense attention despite probably not understanding the standard words. "You kept watch while she slept. You protected her from those who would do harm. You brought her back toward her people when you could have abandoned her or done worse. She chose to place herself under your protection through sleeping beside your fire. This creates bond under our customs, if you accept the responsibility it carries." Garrett looked at Sylara, who was watching him with those large dark eyes that had seen too much violence for someone her age. He thought about the 2 nights keeping watch while she slept beside his small fire, about the trust she'd shown by positioning herself within his protection, about how she'd stayed absolutely silent when the raiders passed close, trusting his judgment about when to hide and when it was safe. About how she'd walked despite pain today because he'd asked her to keep moving toward safety. He wasn't entirely sure he understood what was being offered or what it meant within Keshari cultural frameworks. But he understood that this child needed someone, and for whatever reason, she'd chosen to trust him. "I accept," Garrett said quietly. "If Sylara wants me as her guardian under your customs, I'll fulfill that responsibility to the best of my ability." The leader's skin patterns shifted to colors that might have indicated approval or satisfaction. They turned to Sylara and spoke briefly in Keshari. Sylara responded, her own patterns showing what looked like relief and hope. The leader turned back to Garrett. "It is witnessed and recognized by this patrol. The bond formed in the Dark Watch, confirmed in the light of understanding. You are guardian to Sylara of the River Valley clan, with all rights and responsibilities that status carries among our people." The patrol escorted them back to a Keshari settlement, a temporary refugee camp where survivors from several attacked villages had gathered for mutual protection and support. The camp was a mixture of traditional Keshari dwellings and emergency structures, filled with families who'd lost homes and possessions but survived the violence. Garrett had expected to leave Sylara there and return to his own duties once she was safely with her people. But the settlement leaders made clear that, as recognized guardian, he had both rights and responsibilities regarding her care and well-being. The concept was explained to him more fully by an elder who spoke excellent Standard and seemed to serve as cultural liaison. "Among our people, the guardian bond is sacred. It recognizes that protection offered during darkness and danger creates ties stronger than mere blood relation. You watched over Sylara when she was most vulnerable. You kept the dangers of night from reaching her. You brought her home. These actions create obligation on both sides." "What does that mean practically?" Garrett asked. "It means you are responsible for her welfare as if she were your blood daughter. It means she has claim on your protection and support. It means you make decisions about her education, her future, her well-being in consultation with her, but with final authority as guardian." The elder paused. "But it also means she is obligated to honor you as family, to support you in your old age as you supported her in her youth, to carry your name and memory forward when you pass." It was a greater commitment than Garrett had fully understood when he'd accepted. But looking at Sylara, who was being fed and cared for by the settlement's healers but kept glancing toward where Garrett stood, as if making sure he was still there, he found he didn't regret the decision. She trusted him absolutely. She'd slept beside his fire believing he would protect her even at cost to himself. He would honor that trust, whatever it required. The next weeks were complicated as Garrett navigated what it meant to be guardian to a Keshari child while maintaining his work with the monitoring organization. His supervisors were supportive, particularly when the cultural significance was explained, but the practical logistics were challenging. Garrett visited the refugee settlement regularly, bringing supplies and checking on Sylara's continued recovery. Her ankle healed well under the care of Keshari healers, who had techniques and medicines that worked better on their own physiology than human medical approaches would have. Sylara was learning Standard with remarkable speed, and Garrett worked on improving his Keshari. Their communication became easier with each visit, moving from basic gestures and simple words to actual conversations about her experiences, her fears, her hopes for the future. During one visit, about 6 weeks after he'd first found her, they sat together near the settlement's central fire, a large communal blaze that served both practical and social functions for the Keshari refugees. "My people say you didn't have to protect me," Sylara said in her improving Standard. "They say humans and Keshari are not friends. They say you could have left me in the ruins or hurt me, and no one would have known or cared." "I couldn't have done that," Garrett replied. "You needed help and I had the ability to provide it. Leaving you would have been wrong." "But why?" She was struggling to understand, her skin patterns showing colors that indicated genuine confusion mixed with curiosity. You didn't know me. I'm not your kind. Why did you stay awake to keep watch? Why did you protect me from the raiders when it would have been safer for you to hide alone? Garrett considered how to explain principles he'd internalized so deeply he rarely articulated them consciously. Because you were a child in danger, and I had the training and resources to help. Because leaving you would have violated something fundamental about who I try to be. Because. He paused, searching for the right words, because sometimes the most important thing you can do is just be there for someone who needs you. Keep watch while they sleep. Protect them while they're vulnerable. Not because you'll get something from it or because you have to, but because it's the right thing to do. Sylara was quiet for a long moment, her skin patterns shifting through configurations that suggested deep thought. Then she spoke again. When I chose to sleep beside your fire, I didn't know it would create guardian bond under our customs. I just knew I was too tired to stay awake, and I felt safe near you. Like you wouldn't let anything bad happen while I slept. She looked at him with those large eyes that had seen violence but still held capacity for trust. My people explained what it means that I slept beside your watch. They say it means I trusted you completely. Trusted that you would value my life as much as your own, that you would die before letting harm reach me while I was vulnerable in sleep. Did you, Garrett asked. Trust me that completely, I mean. Yes, Sylara said simply. I don't know why exactly. You were human, and I knew humans had hurt Keshari before, but when you found me and treated my injuries and gave me food. You were kind when you could have been cruel. You were gentle when you could have been rough. You protected when you could have abandoned. Her skin patterns shifted to colors that looked like contentment or peace. So when exhaustion made me need sleep, I positioned myself beside your fire because it felt like the safest place in the world, like nothing could hurt me there. Nothing did hurt you there, Garrett said quietly. And nothing will hurt you now, not if I can prevent it. That's what being your guardian means to me. Being someone you can trust to keep you safe, to stand watch when you need rest, to protect you when danger threatens. The elders say the guardian bond goes both ways, Sylara observed. They say I have responsibilities to you too, as you age and eventually need care. They say when you're old and tired, I'll keep watch while you rest, the way you did for me. That's a long time away, Garrett said with a slight smile. But it will come, and I'll be there. Her expression showed certainty. You gave me safety when I had lost everything. You gave me a place to belong again. When the raiders killed my family, I thought I had lost all connections, all ties. But you kept watch through the dark nights. And now I have family again, even if it's different from before. Garrett felt emotion tighten his throat. He'd just been doing what seemed right in the moment, keeping a frightened child safe, helping her find her people, accepting responsibility when it was offered in a cultural framework he didn't fully understand. He hadn't expected it to mean so much, hadn't expected to feel such connection to this young Keshari who'd trusted him absolutely when she had every reason to be afraid. I'll keep watching, he promised. As long as you need me to, I'll be here. You'll always have a place to belong, someone who values your safety and your life. That's what the guardian bond means to me. And you'll always have someone who remembers that you stood watch when I needed protection most, Sylara replied. Someone who knows that you're the kind of person who stays awake through the dark so that others can rest safely. That matters, Garrett. It matters more than you probably realize. Months passed. The refugee settlement gradually transitioned from emergency shelter to more permanent community as it became clear that many of the displaced Keshari couldn't safely return to their original territories. Garrett helped where he could, using his position with the monitoring organization to advocate for resources and protection. Sylara thrived despite the trauma she'd experienced. She attended the settlement's educational programs, made friends with other young Keshari, and gradually healed from the physical and emotional wounds of the attack. But she never forgot those 2 nights when she'd slept beside a stranger's watch fire, trusting absolutely that he would keep her safe through the dangerous dark. During one of Garrett's visits, nearly a year after he'd first found her, Sylara asked if she could show him something. She led him to a small dwelling on the settlement's edge, a traditional Keshari structure that had been built recently. "The elders helped me make this," she explained. "It's called a guardian house. In our culture, when someone becomes guardian to a child who has no blood family, the community helps build a place where the guardian can stay when they visit. It means you're recognized as part of our community, not just an outsider who helped once." The dwelling was small but beautifully crafted, with traditional Keshari design elements that Garrett had learned to appreciate. There was a sleeping area, a small space for preparing food, and significantly, a fire pit at the center with stones arranged for sitting. "It's like the Watc fire," Sylara said softly. "The fire where I slept safely while you kept guard. The elders say that every guardian house should have a fire at its heart to remember the protection that created the bond." Garrett felt his eyes grow warm with emotion he didn't try to hide. "It's beautiful, Sylara. Thank you." "Thank you," she corrected gently, "for staying awake through those dark nights, for protecting me when you didn't have to, for accepting the bond when you could have walked away." Her skin patterns shifted to colors he'd learned indicated deep affection and gratitude, "for being my guardian when I had lost everyone else." That evening, they sat together beside the fire in the guardian house, much as they'd sat beside that first Watc fire a year ago. But this time, Sylara wasn't a frightened child fighting exhaustion. She was healing and growing and building a new life. And Garrett wasn't a stranger keeping watch over someone he'd just met. He was family, recognized and valued and trusted absolutely. "You know," Sylara said as they watched the flames dance, "I sometimes wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that day. Or if you'd found me but decided it was too dangerous to help. Or if I'd been too afraid to trust you enough to sleep beside your fire." "We'll never know those alternative stories," Garrett replied. "We only know what actually happened. I found you, I chose to help, and you chose to trust me. Everything else follows from those choices." "Good choices," Sylara said with certainty. "The best choices." "Yes," Garrett agreed, "the best choices." The fire burned steadily between them. No longer a desperately maintained watch fire in hostile territory, but a warm hearth in a safe place. Yet it still represented the same fundamental truth. That protection offered without promise or reward could become the foundation of bonds stronger than blood. That trust placed and honored could transform strangers into family. Garrett had kept watch through the dark while a frightened child slept beside his fire. That simple act, motivated by nothing more than basic human decency and the recognition that someone needed help, had created connections that would last a lifetime. No words had been necessary during those long nights. Just presence, protection, and the quiet strength of someone who stayed awake so that another could safely rest. But what had been kindled in that darkness still burned bright. Loyalty forged in silence, safety that had become belonging, and family that transcended worlds and species. The watch fire had died down to embers that first night, then been rebuilt and tended through the second. Now it burned steady and warm in the guardian house, a permanent reminder of the bond created when Garrett had chosen to protect rather than abandon, and Sylara had chosen to trust rather than fear. Some bonds were forged in words and promises, but the strongest ones, Garrett had learned, were built in shared silence, in the simple act of keeping watch while someone slept, of being there when someone needed protection, of honoring trust that was offered freely and absolutely. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the settlement continued its evening routines. And inside the guardian house, two beings from different worlds sat together in comfortable silence, bound by a connection that had been built one quiet night at a time, one act of protection at a time, one moment of trust at a time. The watch continued, and always would.